My husband lied about being a Special Forces veteran for money and respect, until my Uncle Frank brutally exposed him. The first signs were subtle. Looking back, I should have seen them. Tiny fractures in Steve's stories that, over time, formed a pattern I was too in love to recognize. I noticed Uncle Frank watching my husband carefully at the Memorial Day barbecue, his eyes narrowing slightly. When Steve mentioned a classified operation near Kandahar, at the time, I dismissed it. Uncle Frank was always skeptical of everyone. 30 years in the Army and a tour in Vietnam had made him that way. "Honey, can you bring me another beer?" Steve called from across my parents' backyard, interrupting. His story about a helicopter extraction under enemy fire. I smiled and grabbed a Coors Light from the cooler, passing by Uncle Frank, who was unusually quiet. "Your husband seems to know a lot about Special Forces operations," he said casually, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "He doesn't like talking about it much," I replied, the rehearsed answer coming automatically. "The PTSD makes it hard." Frank nodded, his expression unreadable. "Must be difficult." 3 months later, at Thanksgiving, everything I thought I knew about my life collapsed like a house built on sand. We were gathered around my parents' oak dining table, the good china set out for the occasion. My mother was bringing in the turkey when Uncle Frank cleared his throat. "Steve, I've been meaning to ask you, what was your unit designation in Afghanistan?" My husband wiped his mouth with a napkin, that confident smile I'd fallen for spreading across his face. "5th Special Forces Group, ODA 574. Uncle Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. I've been doing some research since our conversation in May, made some calls to old contacts." He paused, his weathered hands folding together on the table. "Steve, I'd like to speak with you and my niece privately after dinner." My stomach dropped. Something in Frank's tone set off alarm bells I couldn't ignore. "Actually," Steve said, placing his hand over mine, "whatever you want to say, you can say in front of family. We don't keep secrets here." The irony of his words would soon become clear. Frank looked at my father, who nodded slightly. "All right," Frank said, reaching down beside his chair for a manila envelope I hadn't noticed before. "I contacted the Special Forces Association, the 5th Group directly, and the Department of Defense Personnel Center." The room went silent. My mother stopped serving, the carving knife suspended mid-air. "There is no record of anyone with your name and date of birth ever serving in the United States military," Frank continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "Not in Special Forces, not in the Army, not anywhere. Updated." Holy crap. Guys, I didn't expect this post to blow up overnight. Thanks for all the supportive messages. This has been the hardest thing I've ever shared publicly. I'm still processing everything. Have any of you ever discovered your partner's entire identity was fabricated? The history of the lie: I met Steve 5 years ago at a charity 5K for veterans. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my boring job at an insurance company. On our 3rd date, he opened up about his military past. It was hard for him to talk about, he said. The memories were difficult. I felt honored that he trusted me enough to share. The signs were there from the beginning, but I rationalized them away. Steve never had photos from his service. He'd left them behind because the memories were too painful. He didn't stay in touch with anyone from his unit. They had scattered after the ambush, and he couldn't bear to reach out. When military topics came up with actual veterans, he would get quiet, claiming it triggered his PTSD. The scar on his lower back seemed to validate everything. When I asked about it, he described in vivid detail the ambush outside Kandahar, the shrapnel that tore through his body armor, the 2 teammates who died pulling him to safety. I never questioned further. It seemed cruel to make him relive such trauma. After we married 2 years ago, Steve gradually integrated his military background into every aspect of our lives. When he couldn't sleep, it was PTSD. When he got angry over small things, it was his combat training making him hypervigilant. When he needed expensive supplements or special equipment for his rehabilitation, my family eagerly helped out. My parents aren't wealthy, but they're comfortable. Dad owns a small construction company, and Mom teaches elementary school. They raised me to respect military service above almost everything else. My grandfather and 2 uncles served. Military photos hang in their hallway alongside family portraits. When I brought home a wounded warrior, they embraced him completely. Over the 18 months before that fateful Thanksgiving, my family had given Steve approximately $23,000 for what he called specialized therapies and treatments that weren't covered by the VA. The money came in increments: $400 here for specialized pain management, $200 there for a PTSD retreat program. Dad paid for a $4,000 home gym equipment set that Steve claimed would help with his rehabilitation. Mom regularly slipped him $200–300 for pain management supplements. My aunt and uncle funded a $7,000 therapeutic retreat for veterans that Steve supposedly attended. I never saw receipts or documentation. When I gently asked once, Steve got defensive. You think I'm lying about needing treatment? The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Of course I trusted him. How could I not? Steve had done his research. He watched documentaries, read books, and even played military video games to learn terminology. He knew the right acronyms to drop into conversation with civilians. He had explanations for why certain missions were classified and couldn't be discussed. He wore dog tags occasionally, which I later learned you can buy online for $15. When my cousin's son asked to see his medals, Steve explained they were in a special display case at his mother's house in Oregon. A mother, I would discover, who didn't exist. But Uncle Frank wasn't a civilian. He had spent 30 years in the Army, including service in Vietnam and later as a training officer. After that Memorial Day barbecue, Frank had started quietly taking notes, checking facts, and contacting old military connections. By Thanksgiving, he had compiled irrefutable evidence that my husband had fabricated his entire military career. The unraveling Steve's face remained composed after Frank's accusation, but I noticed the subtle changes, the tightening around his eyes, the forced casual posture. Frank, there must be some mistake, he said, his voice steady. Records get lost all the time in the system. You know how the VA is with paperwork. My uncle opened the manila envelope and carefully laid several official documents on the table. This is a response from the Army Human Resources Command confirming no record of your service. This is from the National Personnel Records Center stating the same. This is a statement from the Special Forces Association. He paused, sliding another paper forward. And this is a signed statement from Colonel James Westbrook, the commanding officer you claimed to serve under during your second tour. He has never heard of you. My father's face had turned a dangerous shade of red. My mother's hand covered her mouth. I felt the room spinning around me, my brain refusing to process what I was hearing. The operations you described in Kandahar? Frank continued, his voice controlled but tight with anger. The dates don't align with actual special forces deployments in that region. The extraction protocol you mentioned doesn't match military procedure. The medal ceremony you described to us last Christmas would have been documented in multiple databases. Steve's charm vanished in an instant. His expression hardened, eyes darting around the table, looking for an ally and finding none. Steve? I managed to whisper, my voice breaking. Is this true? He turned to me, reaching for my hand. I pulled away instinctively. Babe, this is clearly some kind of mix-up, he said, but the confidence was gone from his voice. Frank's got the wrong information. The scar, I said, barely audible. You're back. A strange voice spoke from the other end of the table. Appendectomy, age 19. We all turned to look at my cousin Rachel, who was staring at her plate, her face flushed. We dated briefly in college, before he moved away. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Steve had told me he was deployed overseas during the years he would have been in college. Nothing made sense anymore. You dated my cousin? I asked, my voice hollow. Rachel nodded, not meeting my eyes. I recognized him at the family reunion last year, but he pretended not to know me. I figured he was embarrassed, so I played along. I never imagined. Her voice trailed off. Steve's facade cracked completely. This is ridiculous, he snapped, pushing back from the table. So I embellished a little. Everyone does it. Is it my fault your family throws money at anyone in uniform? The cruelty of his words stunned the room into silence. I realized then that I didn't know this man at all. The person I married was a complete fabrication. How much did you take from my family? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Steve shrugged, standing up. I didn't keep track. It's not like I forced anyone to write those checks. My father half rose from his chair, but my mother put a restraining hand on his arm. Get out of my house, she said, her voice cold. Now. Steve looked around the table one last time, his eyes finally landing on me. Coming? The question hung in the air between us, absurd in its normalcy, as if he were simply asking if I was ready to leave a dinner party. I'll have your things packed tomorrow, I said quietly. Don't come to the house tonight. For a brief moment, I saw genuine shock in his eyes. He hadn't expected this outcome. He thought his charm would save him, that I was too invested in our marriage to walk away, even from a foundation of lies. You'll regret this, he said, grabbing his jacket. All of you. As the front door closed behind him, I collapsed into my chair, my entire body shaking. The beautiful Thanksgiving table sat untouched, food growing cold as my family gathered around me, their own shock temporarily set aside to deal with mine. I'll call a locksmith, my father said quietly. I've got a security system we can install tonight, Uncle Frank added. You'll stay here for now, my mother declared. Not a question, but a statement. As they moved around me, making plans and arrangements, I sat frozen, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for truth in a sea of lies. How had I missed it? How had I been so completely fooled? Updated. Thanks for all the support and advice. You've given me strength during this nightmare. I've secured our financial accounts and contacted a lawyer. Steve's been texting threats alternating with apologies. The most disturbing part? Finding evidence he's done this before to other women. Has anyone dealt with a pathological liar who had multiple fake identities? The aftermath. The weeks following Thanksgiving were a blur of legal meetings, tearful discoveries, and security precautions. Steve's threats escalated, then suddenly stopped, which was somehow more unsettling. I filed for divorce immediately, citing fraud and misrepresentation. I also filed a police report detailing the financial exploitation of my family. Going through, our apartment was like excavating an archaeological site of lies. In a locked drawer, I found a burner phone with texts to someone he called manager, discussing military angles and potential targets. There were credit card statements showing purchases from military surplus stores and websites selling replica medals and certificates. I discovered emails confirming payments for self-improvement courses that aligned perfectly with the therapy sessions he claimed to attend. Most disturbing were several fake IDs with different names, but Steve's photo, along with scraps of notes about other women, their family backgrounds, interests, and what appeared to be financial assessments. My name was among them, with notes about my military family background and potential support network. The fragments painted a picture of systematic targeting rather than opportunistic deception. I turned everything over to the police, but their response was frustrating. Unless we can prove he specifically requested money by falsely claiming military service, it's difficult to make fraud charges stick, the detective explained. The financial support could be interpreted as gifts between family members. Without written agreements or direct evidence of solicitation, we're limited in what we can pursue. My family was devastated not just by the financial loss, but by the emotional betrayal. They had shared personal stories of their own service with Steve, looking for connection and understanding. My grandfather had shown Steve his WW2 memorabilia, precious artifacts he rarely displayed. All of it had been received by Steve with fake camaraderie and understanding, every shared moment now tainted. Uncle Frank took it especially hard. As a real veteran who had seen genuine trauma and loss, Steve's performance felt like a personal insult. Men died over there, he told me one evening as we sat on my parents' porch. Real men with real families. And this guy used their sacrifice like a costume he could put on when it suited him. The divorce process dragged on longer than expected. Steve hired a surprisingly good lawyer who fought against every claim of fraud. It took 6 months and nearly drained my savings, but eventually the judge, himself a Navy veteran, granted the divorce on grounds of fraud and misrepresentation. The protection order against Steve was approved based on his threatening messages and the evidence of identity deception. My family decided against pursuing civil action for the money Steve had taken. We'd be throwing good money after bad, my father reasoned. He's probably spent it all anyway. Instead, we focused on healing and rebuilding trust. My parents never once blamed me, though I blamed myself enough for everyone. 8 months after Thanksgiving, I received a call from a woman in Arizona. "Is this Steve Reynolds' wife?" she asked, her voice tense. "Ex-wife," I corrected. "Who is this?" "My name is Diane," she said. "I've been dating a man who says he's a former Marine sniper, named Steve Carson. I found your number in his phone with a warning label." My blood ran cold. "Diane, I need to tell you some things about Steve. We talked for nearly 2 hours. She'd been suspicious for weeks after noticing inconsistencies in his stories about his military service. Her brother was an active-duty Marine who had asked questions Steve couldn't answer. When she confronted him, he'd become defensive and manipulative, making her doubt herself. "Thank you," she said before hanging up. "I thought I was going crazy." 3 days later, she texted me a photo of Steve's empty apartment. She'd left while he was at work and filed a police report about the identity theft she'd discovered. Another woman freed from his web of lies. The rebuilding, 1 year after the exposure at Thanksgiving dinner, I was finally beginning to feel like myself again. I had moved to a new apartment in a different neighborhood, changed my phone number and email addresses, and even started using my maiden name again professionally. The security cameras I'd installed were more for peace of mind than actual necessity. Steve had apparently moved on to new targets in other states. I still had moments of paralyzing doubt, questioning my own judgment and ability to recognize deception. My therapist assured me this was normal, that trusting again would take time. "The goal isn't to become perpetually suspicious," she told me. "It's to develop healthier skepticism while remaining open to authentic connection." Uncle Frank had become an unexpected source of strength throughout the process. His military background had given him a solid bullshit detector, but also a deep understanding of genuine trauma and recovery. He connected me with a support group for people who had been targets of similar schemes. Hearing their stories helped me feel less naive, less culpable. The most surprising connection came through Diane from Arizona. She had started a private online forum for women who had been deceived by men falsely claiming military service. Through this network, we identified at least 3 other women Steve had targeted over the past decade, each using a slightly different military persona. We shared information with each other and with authorities in multiple states, slowly building a case. My family created new traditions to replace the ones that had been tainted. Instead of focusing on military service as the ultimate measure of character, we celebrated authenticity and honesty. We started a monthly family dinner where we'd each share something true and meaningful from our lives, a deliberate counter to the culture of deception Steve had created. At one of these dinners, Uncle Frank brought a guest, his friend Marcus, another Vietnam veteran who ran a support group for military families. As I helped clear dishes afterward, Marcus stopped me in the kitchen. "Frank told me what happened," he said. "I've seen this before. These guys, they prey on military families because they know how much we value service and sacrifice." I nodded, having heard similar statements from the therapist I'd been seeing. "There's a name for what you experienced," Marcus continued. "It's called external identity trauma, when you discover that someone integral to your identity has fundamentally misrepresented themselves. It's like grieving someone who never existed." That phrase hit me like a physical blow. I was grieving someone who had never existed. The Steve I loved, the brave, wounded warrior who had overcome so much, that person was a complete fiction. I had fallen in love with and married a character in an elaborate performance. 18 months after the Thanksgiving revelation, I received a call from a detective in California. They had arrested Steve for fraud, identity theft, and stolen valor in connection with a scheme targeting elderly veterans. The evidence from multiple victims, including the documentation we had compiled through Diane's network, had finally created a case strong enough for prosecution. They wanted to know if I would testify about my experience when the case went to trial. Without hesitation, I said yes. That evening, I sat on my new balcony watching the sunset, feeling something I hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Not because Steve was facing consequences, though that helped, but because I had survived. The woman who had been so completely deceived had emerged stronger, wiser, and surrounded by authentic love. The lies that had been meant to destroy me had instead forced me to rebuild on a foundation of truth. And that, I realized, was something Steve, with all his deceptions, would never understand or experience. Updated. It's been 2 years since I posted this story. Steve is now serving 5 years for multiple fraud charges. I've finally found peace and am dating someone wonderful who passed Uncle Frank's background check with flying colors. Has anyone else found that surviving betrayal ultimately made you stronger? Or am I just telling myself that to cope?